Hello there. So, I'm sure we all wish that we could be doing this in person, but things could be worse. We could be living in a dystopia right now. And I know what you're thinking. It is one. But I don't think it's a dystopia yet. I mean, yeah, there's the mask thing, there's the lockdowns, there's the shot that's going to turn our blood into jello. But it can't be a dystopia yet because it's all right. Nobody's making pills that limit your behavior and the actions that you. Okay, well, nobody is making Terminators yet. Ah, fuck, dude. So, it is a dystopia, but where's the cool aesthetic? What, I'm supposed to wear pool noodles on my head? I was promised a fucking cool ass uniform. And the trains don't run on time, and our propaganda, it's like Benetton ads, but gayer. So, early on, I debated what it was I wanted to present about. And I initially considered talking about moral absolutism and natural law, the different ways that this phenomenon has been observed throughout history, the different schools of philosophy that have outlined this principle, how it is that we can conclude morality must be absolute. I mean, you're proposing a metric system, so the measurement has to be consistent. And, if you presuppose that you possess your own body, then it stands to reason, okay, wait, I'm going to cut myself off, because if I start, I'm not going to stop. And I wanted to talk about something that was pragmatic, but still allowed me to discuss an ideal. And as nice as it would be to talk about ethics at length and arm people with that knowledge, I would actually just much rather that people be armed. And what I've come to believe is not necessarily that we need people who understand and can teach natural law, but that we require people who understand and can enforce natural law. Because it's force that guarantees the maintenance of any system of beliefs ultimately. And so, to that end, the natural right to self-defense and its manifestation in the Second Amendment. So what is this? What am I doing? What is this about? Well, I'll tell you what I'm not doing. I'm not here to convert anybody. So if you're watching this and you support gun control, this is not for you. You know your wine aunt? You know your wine aunt. She rage posts on Facebook about the NRA and she donates to every town for gun safety. You can't show this to her to win her over. This is not going to convince her of anything. Realistically, we're just going to get rid of your wine aunt. And I know that sounds harsh, but she's made her choice, and given the chance, she'd do the same to you. Well, actually, she would defer that to somebody else. Besides, when you come for her, what's she going to do? Pull a fucking gun on you? Nah. I'll tell you what else I'm not going to do. I'm not going to go over any statistics. I'm not going to go over empiric data. I'm not going to make a utilitarian argument for gun ownership. I'm not going to tell you to cross-reference FBI Crime Table 20 with FBI Crime Table 43A. I'm not doing that. So, what is this? Well, it is a presentation, but only in form. This is a proposition. Maybe it's a worldview. And hopefully it is a glimpse at the form that we'll have to assume in bringing about natural law. Now, if you consider yourself a supporter of the Second Amendment in any capacity, this is for you. And depending on the vigor that you have, maybe it's intended to radicalize you a bit. Now, when I say radicalize, the thing that we have to understand is what we're talking about is radical. It is extreme by its very nature. So, this is not an appeal to the opposition. And this isn't even an appeal to mainstream culture. I mean, why the fuck would I appeal to a culture that has allowed the proliferation of child drag queens? Listen, Desmond isn't amazing. Desmond is a sign of a collapsing civilization. Now I know what some of you are thinking. And let me clarify. This is not a call to action. This is not a call to violence. Well, not yet anyway. I might do that later. That's a joke. I'm joking. But, hypothetically, If you've already got the moving truck rented and the fertilizer's sensitized and packed away, I can't stop you. There's nothing that I can do to stop you from what you are going to do. And all I'm saying is that you'll probably be canonized in some sort of new religion as a saint, and you'll live on in our spirit for all time. All right, I'm joking around, but I'm going to try to be serious because I actually consider this extremely vital information. And I consider it vital because I'm an advocate of peace, which I know probably sounds strange to some people. Oh, he's talking about guns, he's talking about the Second Amendment, he's talking about self-defense and violence. How can you say that you're peaceful? Well, to be peaceful isn't the same thing as being a pacifist. Now, a pacifist is someone who is either unwilling or incapable of any type of force. And to be peaceful is just to be restrained in how you go about using force. Now, a pacifist is always at the mercy of those around them who are prepared to use force for one reason or another. And I don't believe that that can facilitate any sort of peaceful state. In fact, I would say that the capacity for peace is always going to be found alongside the capacity for war. And as the quote goes, to be prepared for war is one of the most effectual means of preserving peace. George Washington said that. And before I begin, a couple more quotes just to set the tone. The truth is, all might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought. Samuel Adams. And we might ask ourselves, are we where we are because we haven't defended freedom or because we haven't valued it properly? Which could it be? And one more. If, by the instrument of governmental power, a nationality is led toward its destruction, then rebellion is not only the right of every member of such a people, it is his duty. Adolf Hitler. Wait, what? Did he really say that? He did. In Mein Kampf, huh? Okay. Well, he was right about that. And it does shed light on an important notion that government policy is not and cannot ever be considered infallible or an ends in itself. And that's a very basic concept, actually. It's one that people only seem to acknowledge when it conforms to their worldview. Legality and morality are not the same thing. So whether something is legal or not, that's a totally separate matter from whether it's right or wrong to do. And if legalism were the source of right and wrong, then you couldn't have developed legalism to begin with. So the basis for any legal system is derived from elsewhere. Something that's codified into legality never begins as legality. And the flip side of that is, if something were right or wrong based on the law, well, once it was made law, it would become unassailable. So what we need to do is we need to make a distinction between a legal right and a natural right. Now, a legal right is something that government grants its citizens. So, of course, that requires organization, statecraft, legislation, and then enforcement of all of those systems has to be taking place as well. But if the government can grant something, then it can also take it away. And that isn't really a right. That's a privilege. So, a natural right, in the most simple terms, is something which you're able to do inherently, but in performing that action, you don't prevent any other agent from the same thing. It can be willed universally. Now, we don't arrive at what constitutes a natural right by legislation, debate, social interaction, any form of empiricism. No, natural right, it can only be understood rationally. It's a priori. It's a first principle. So, self-defense conforms to that precisely. It is the use of violence, but in a way that can be willed universally as a reaction to aggression. And in addition, we could say that the ownership of arms would fit that as well. It doesn't prevent anybody else's ability to own weaponry for me to own weaponry. There's no mutual exclusivity. There's no zero-sum nature in that. Now, here's where the issue is. How many people do you know personally that will justify something because there's a law regarding it? And the truth is, that's where the average person is. The average person can't actually make a distinction between right or wrong, good or evil. What they are social ballasts. And what I mean by that is within a certain tolerance, people will basically just kind of replicate whatever behavior they see going on around them. And in a moral society, they might be moral people, incidentally at least. But in a degenerate society, they will continue to be degenerate. So it's this appeal to what's popular and this appeal to legalism and politics that people like to make that makes the Constitution extraordinarily relevant to what we're discussing. Now, ultimately, the appeal to legalism or politics, it's just about being able to read rules and apply them. So what we should do is we should take a look at the language codifying our legal right to the ownership of weaponry. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, the text is telling us that a well-regulated militia is required or necessary to the security or maintenance of this free state. Now, immediately, revisionists are going to cry out, Actually, you know what? I'm not going to let some stupid ass shit like this come out of my mouth. I have a solution. Give me just a second.
The military or the National Guard is the militia, so you're only able to be armed if you're in the military.
Alright, you are either being dishonest or retarded if you say this, and generally it is a little bit of both. So, to start, a militia is specifically and distinctly different than the military, who are composed of dedicated warfighters that stand in perpetuity. Now, the militia is formed of citizens, and they only muster in times of need. So, in Federalist Paper 24, Hamilton refers to the garrisoning of men on the western frontier, and he makes a distinction between a standing corps and militia detachments. Now, his reasoning for using a standing corps is he worries that the militia will tire out if they're separated from their families and their occupations for too long. So if it's the case that these militiamen have occupations that they would typically be attending to, then we can obviously gather that they're not dedicated to being standing soldiers. Then in Federalist Paper 25, Hamilton indicates that a standing army should exist. And he says, the steady operations of war against a regular and disciplined army can only be successfully conducted by a force of the same kind. Considerations of economy, not less than of stability and vigor, confirm this position. The American militia, in the course of the late war, have, by their valor on numerous occasions, erected eternal monuments to their fame. But the bravest of them feel and know that the liberty of their country could not have been established by their efforts alone, however great and valuable they were. Now again, this is a clear indication that the militia are not, and were never thought of as being the military. In addition, outlined in Federalist Paper 29, Hamilton refers to the militia as a localized state entity, and says that they only answer to the federal body when it's necessary. It is explicitly stated that the large body of the militia is to be made up of common people, while only a small standing corps of officers that are appointed at the state level would exist consistently. Now, additionally, Hamilton also indicates that a separate standing army ought to exist specifically to keep the militia from withering under constant stress and use. He, again and again throughout these papers, outlines the difference between standing officers and militia members. So we know that there was never any notion that the militia and the military would be the same entity. It can't be overstated how obvious it is that the militia is supposed to be composed of average citizens, and one of the most common forms of revisionism is to dispute this fact. Now, Hamilton is actually quoted on the subject as saying, the militia is a voluntary force, not associated or under the control of the states, except when called out. A permanent or long-standing force would be entirely different in makeup and call. Tench Coxe of Pennsylvania stated, The militia, who are in fact the effective part of the people at large, will render many troops quite unnecessary. They'll form a powerful check upon the regular troops and will generally be sufficient to overawe them. Well, unfortunately, that hasn't quite panned out. And I guess the call for a standing corps today is war profiteering, securing international financial hegemony, defending poppy fields, setting up oil pipelines. Oh, yeah. And dying for Israel. I mean, you can cut it off, but they still know. Everybody knows. You're not supposed to talk about it, though, otherwise you're an anti. Given that state is capitalized, we can gather that this isn't referring to a state of being or to the individual states of the Union, but to an organized structure of citizenry and government. Now, that state is meant to be a free one, so keep that in mind. In fact, keep it at the front of your mind and then sear it in. A free state. That is what is meant to be kept secure by this militia. So, presumably, to the extent that that quality wasn't one found in the state, not only would the militia have no obligation to provide security for it, but ostensibly, they would muster to oppose whatever the issue or whoever the issue obstructing the free portion of that state was. But what does well-regulated mean?
Well-regulated means government oversight, and that means that gun control is the regulation.
Oh, okay, that is pretty clever, and that almost works. But only if you struggle with literacy or you have some kind of ulterior motive. Now, the phrase well-regulated, it actually refers to keeping something in regular or standardized working order. Basically, there is a necessary degree of uniformity and regulation among the individuals within the militia. Now, it couldn't refer to regulatory oversight of privately held weaponry by the federal government. No body was assembled at that time for something so granular. And regulation of the militia it's continually referenced through the Federalist Papers, but in every instance, it's in regards as to how these people are going to be trained, how they're going to be assembled from the body of the people into their collective formation in a way that is effective, but doesn't allow for abuse of the militia at the hands of the government. So, no mention is ever made of limitations on arms in regards to the militia, anywhere, in any of these documents. The overwhelming concern is, how do we train them? How do we organize them? How do we assemble them when required? Now, in Federalist Paper number 4, John Jay advocates for the federal structure as means of making sure that the militia has one plan of discipline for the sake of national defense. Now, he refers to trade as being prudently regulated, but to the militia as being properly organized and disciplined. Then, in Federalist Paper 29, Hamilton says in regards to the training of the militia, this desirable uniformity can only be accomplished by confiding the regulation of the militia to the direction of the national authority. It is therefore with the utmost evident propriety that the plan of the convention proposes to empower the Union to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such a part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia accordingly to the discipline prescribed by Congress. So what we can gather from this is not only that our government has failed in maintaining this system, but based on Hamilton's other writing, the militia are expected to be armed at parity with the regular or standing corps which exist, in addition to having the same familiarity in tactics. So the militia can best be described as a decentralized, voluntary, paramilitary force. In essence, what they're talking about is that individuals who are mustered into an organizational structure have to maintain a certain degree of uniformity for the sake of multiplying their collective force. Now we come to the phrase, the right of the people to keep and bear arms. And it's fairly clear, right? The term militia isn't used here. So if it's the right of the people to keep and bear arms, which means to possess and carry, it can't be disputed that the thing that is being described is the right to individual arms ownership. Now, it's obvious that the people are going to be the ones to form the militia, and the idea is that they're already supposed to be armed as a prerequisite for their assembly into that collective form. For a bit of additional context, though, we can actually look at the first draft of the Second Amendment. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, a well-armed and well-regulated militia being the best security of a free country. But no person religiously scrupulous of bearing arms shall be compelled to render military service in person. So, what we can gather from this first draft is that the intent was the same from the very beginning, to outline the right of ordinary people to own weaponry in private form. Now, that is required to facilitate the formation of the militia. And we can also see that the term country was used instead of state. That is another way that we can ensure that it's not about a state of being or individuated states. It's supposed to be about the maintenance of the Union as a whole. Now, obviously that final portion didn't make it in. It was included with respect to Quakers who practice pacifism, but fuck pacifists. So we can also look at a quote from James Madison, who is largely credited as the author of the Second Amendment, who in Federalist Paper 46 stated, "Besides the advantage of being armed, which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation, the existence of subordinate governments to which the people are attached, and by which the militia officers are appointed, forms a barrier against the enterprises of ambition more insurmountable than any which a simple government of any form can admit of." So he's stating pretty clearly that it's an advantage that the American people, the citizenry, are armed. Now, at this point, we're just covering the word of a document. And keep in mind, that is the same pretense that many of those who oppose the right to bear arms claim that they're maintaining. But the structure of the text itself and all of the writing that serves as greater context or reference for that text, well, it indicates that there's only one valid argument, one valid interpretation, that ownership of arms is guaranteed for individuals so that they might assemble into militias in the maintenance of a free state. Now, whether you're assembled as a militia or not, that doesn't change the right to keep and bear arms. And finally, we come to shall not be infringed. And it's evident what this means. Don't undermine it, don't encroach on it, and don't fuck with it. Now, this should also make it pretty clear that the text itself isn't granting the right to bear arms. It's actually only recognizing the right to own weaponry by the happenstance of indicating that the government shall not be able to limit this right. And this is an important distinction to make. It's one that people really need to understand. The right to own weaponry shouldn't be considered one that is granted by the Constitution. This right existed before the document was ever drafted. It didn't suddenly become a right once it was committed to paper. Now, Tench Coxe spoke to the notion of individual ownership and infringement. The power of the sword, say the minority of Pennsylvania, is in the hands of Congress. My friends and countrymen, it is not so. For the powers of the sword are in the hands of the yeomanry of America from 16 to 60. The militia of these commonwealths, entitled and accustomed to their arms when compared with any possible army, must be tremendous and irresistible. Who are the militia? Are they not ourselves? It is feared, then, that we shall turn our arms, each man against his own bosom? Congress has no power to disarm the militia. Their swords and every terrible implement of the soldier are the birthright of Americans. every terrible implement. What did he mean by this? Well, there is a term that we haven't covered yet. Arms. That brings us to another common piece of rhetoric.
The founders were only familiar with muskets, and so that's what the Second Amendment applies to.
All right, where do I even start with this? 1, that's not a real argument. 2, it's wrong. 3, it's dishonest. 4, it's retarded. But should we actually buy the notion that the founders couldn't envision any advancement of weaponry? Now, the obvious trend of weaponry at that time was all in the vein of producing repeating fire. And this is the point where I could bring up stuff like the Girandoni air rifle. I could talk about the Belton flintlock rifle. I could talk about the puckle gun. I could talk about all these different cannons and artillery. I could talk about privately owned warship, but you know what? I'm not going to elaborate on any of that shit because the technicality and the mechanics don't matter. It has to be noted that the term arms is used. And the same way that we can look at something like the term well-regulated from documents at that time, well, we can actually just look at a dictionary from that time. And how about Samuel Johnson's 1755 English Dictionary, which defined arms as weapons of offense or armor of defense? Oh, so it's a general term. And it has been understood as a general term since at least 1755. It refers to all forms of weaponry and armament. So then, what does the term arms encompass? Well, here's what some people are going to tell you, and I guess that revolvers and lever guns shouldn't have been made. We should have stopped much earlier than we did, clearly. Well, now you've got your FUDs. That shotgun should actually have wooden furniture, I guess. Synthetic material bad, wood good. Guns for hunting. You know the type. So here's where we are currently. They're semi-automatic firearms. They're arms, but what else are arms? Okay, well, machine guns, explosives. That makes sense. They're used to great effect in warfare every day. But what about... Oh, okay, well, yeah, the military is equipped with artillery, missiles, aircrafts. The militia is going to need access to that as well. There's something missing, though. What could be missing? Oh, nuclear arms. And yeah, that is the logical and necessary conclusion of this. Now, consider that at the point someone is capable of maintaining and owning a nuclear weapon, we're not talking about an individual anymore, but a group that is capable of this. But what would make them or anybody less legitimate an owner of such a weapon than the government? What this comes down to is the Second Amendment doesn't make any mention of technicality or mechanics because it's a principle. It's outlining a principle that in order to maintain freedom under government, individuals are going to have to be able to arm and muster with parity, if not superiority, to government forces. And it's very simple. If the government is able to monopolize a form of weaponry, and then they use that weaponry to prevent you from having the same thing, you are a slave. Now, for anybody who tells you that the Second Amendment has nothing to do with deposing a tyrannical state, Hamilton in Federalist Paper 28. If the representatives of the people betray their constituents, then there is no resource left but in the exertion of that original right of self-defense, which is paramount to all positive forms of government, and which against the usurpations of the national rulers may be exerted with infinitely better prospect of success than against those of the rulers of an individual state. In a single state, if the persons entrusted with supreme power become usurpers, the different parcels, subdivisions, or districts of which it consists, having no distinct government in each, can take no regular measures for defense. The citizens must rush tumultuously to arms, without concert, without system, without resource, except in their courage and despair. And this excerpt actually tells us quite a bit. So, if citizens are moving so quickly to arms without organization, that would imply that they're already armed. He's describing that there are times where armed citizenry aren't even going to form the militia structure before acting. And if the argument that the citizenry couldn't mount an offensive against the government lies on the basis that there's too great of a technical disparity between the two, that isn't an argument for further disarmament. That is a case for why you need to repeal every form of gun control and then keep going. So, let's summarize. The militia is not a standing body of troops. It's composed of ordinary citizens, and it's not the same thing as the military. The term state refers to the entire federal system and its citizens. To be well regulated is to be assembled in an organized fashion, possessing a degree of uniformity. The right to arms is recognized as one of the people, which are the individual citizens. Arms is a general term which includes all forms of weaponry and armament, and infringement is anything which would impede or impair the ability to be armed. So now we come to one of the biggest mistakes that's been made by proponents of our right to arms. We've fallen victim to the false dialectic of the gun debate as it's framed. Now, it's not about guns, and it never has been. The Second Amendment doesn't mention firearms. It's about arms. And this distinction has to be made, because the moment it's only a matter of firearms, you've already ceded an enormous amount of ground. And not only that, but by allowing the framing to exist in that fashion, many of the people who support the right to arms, they just defend the status quo. They just defend things as they are right now. There's no forward momentum. It's too reserved of a position to function as even a defensive one. So what you wind up doing is you just oppose new infringement, but you don't necessarily question that which is already passed. So where we are right now is we're standing on vastly eroded ground, and it's continuing to crumble. And that's the thing about erosion. It is a slow process in its totality, but it's very effective at wearing something down to nothing. So we've undergone a process of attrition in our ability to be armed. And this course of infringement has largely been waged over the past 80 years. Now, in 1934, the National Firearms Act passed, and this was the first instance of federal gun control. So it formed the foundation for the beginning of this process of attrition that we faced. And this act forced the regulation of automatic weapons, short-barreled rifles and shotguns, and suppressors. It made it so that they required a registry, as well as a $200 tax stamp, which is about $4,000 today. Then in 1938, the Federal Firearms Act passed, and this made it so that the transfer of firearms to felons was illegal, but in addition to that, it forced all manufacturers, sellers, and importers of firearms to get federal licensure as well. It also required them to maintain records of anybody buying firearms. I don't know about you, but I think it's pretty cool that a cousin fucking cripple still managed to find a way to step all over people's rights. Now, 1938, this is actually a Supreme Court case, U.S. v. Miller. And the court ruled that Miller's short-barreled shotgun was not protected by the Second Amendment, and they cited the NFA as support for this. Now, their reasoning was that the Second Amendment was only supposed to protect military-type weapons, and that the NFA was fine because it was just intended to collect revenue. Now, this ruling kind of doesn't make sense, because the NFA is obviously cost prohibitive. That is a form of infringement, so it should already be in lapse with the Second Amendment. But beyond that, where was it ever established that the Second Amendment only applies to military-style weaponry? Though, if that's the case, that does kind of raise some serious issues for modern gun control advocates. Now, skip forward to Lyndon Johnson. He signs the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968 into effect. And this raised the age to 21 to buy handguns. It's also worth noting that this set the foundation for allowing wiretapping. Now, later in the same year, the Gun Control Act of 1968 was signed into effect. And this made it so that rifles, shotguns, they could no longer be mail ordered. And it prohibited the interstate transfer of all firearms. It also mandated serialization for all firearms. In addition, restrictions were put in place that if you were going to import a firearm to the US, it had to have sporting purposes. Now, that's something to focus on because it presumes that the reason to own a firearm is for sport. Then in 1986, we got the Firearm Owners Protection Act. And that sounds great, right? It legalized ammo shipment through the United States Postal Service. It removed the requirement for record of sale on ammunition. It allowed for the transportation of firearms that would ordinarily be illegal in some states through those states. Oh, well, it also outlawed the sale and ownership of any automatic weapons produced after 1986. I'm sure you feel very protected. You know, it's a little bit like your rapist dressing up before the act. It's very considerate. You know, if you know a conservative and they sing the praises of Reagan and they say they support the Second Amendment, do me a favor. Pelt them with jelly beans. Now, in 1988, the Undetectable Firearms Act passed, and this prevented the creation, import, or sale of any guns with less than 3.7 ounces of metal content. And it was fear-mongering over the Glock 17 that led to this. Basically, people thought that guns were going to become undetectable by metal detectors. Now, this has been continually renewed at every sunset, and it's set to expire in 2023. I wonder if 3D printers are going to be mentioned anywhere in the new legislation. Then in 1994, the assault weapons ban happened. Now, this expired in 2004, and there have been efforts to bring it back, but none of them have been successful so far. But during this time, no assault weapons could be manufactured or sold to the public. In addition, magazines with more than 10 rounds were outlawed as well. And for assault weapons and magazines that were owned prior to this, they had a grandfather clause that was adopted. So there wasn't confiscation of any previously owned property. But wait, what's an assault weapon? Well, it's really just a useful political term, and it sounds scary. Now, it refers to guns that look a certain way. So, the two guns that you see pictured here, they're the same rifle. The difference is just in their furniture. Now, that top one, that's an assault weapon. It's because of its stock, its grip, and the flash hider. Now, gun control advocates will claim, well, it's not a big deal then, because it doesn't make that big of a difference if they're basically the same rifle. Well, if it's not that big of a difference, then why ban them at all? Notice that every instance of infringement, every form of limitation or regulation that is imposed, it's not that big of a deal. It's just a little more. It's just common sense. Yeah, well, we've been losing ground to just common sense, just a little more, and not that big of a deal for 8 fucking decades. And in 2019, bump stocks were banned, but this was actually overturned just a couple months ago. And there are other modern mechanisms that aren't just federal limitations that we can cover as well. Now, that term assault weapon, it's stuck really well. And a lot of states have continued to impose laws that outlaw these cosmetic and utilitarian features. In addition to that, many states ban high-capacity magazines. Now, there's no consistent definition for what a high-capacity magazine is. Supposedly, a 30-round magazine is high capacity, despite the fact that it's a pretty standard size for any intermediate caliber rifle. Some people say it's anything over 10 rounds, but it is a relative term and there's no clear definition. You would think that at least it would vary from gun to gun. You know, I guess the problem is that people who use the term high capacity magazine have low capacity brains. There are also universal background checks that have spread throughout different states, and there is a concerted effort to make them nationwide. Now, background checks already exist, so what is a universal background check? Are you making sure that I don't have a fucking record on Mars? Well, what it actually does is it forces people to pay transfer fees and get background checks when they engage in private sale with one another. So, ostensibly, all this actually does is prevent ordinary people from transferring firearms between one another, and it forces a new layer of bureaucracy and extortion on the people who are willing to comply. So over the last couple years, extreme risk protection orders have become the new trend. And, well, the risk is extreme. I want protection from extreme risk, right? It's a great name. It's a lot better than the name that you might recognize it by, which would be red flag laws. So these are ex parte orders. Now what that means is they're issued without the knowledge of the involved party. It allows police to directly disarm the people who have been flagged, and the grounds for this are based solely on what the accusatory party states about the individual. There's no real due process involved. And we can also look at something like the introduction of the TAPS Act. That stands for Threat Assessment, Protection, and Safety. Okay, so it's something that's going to make us safe. What could be wrong with that? Well, the way that it makes you safe is it allows police to individually assess people and households, and then allows the police to make a red flag designation. So that's very cool because it actually shits on the Fourth Amendment just as a means of shitting on the Second as well. And it's always in the name of safety. That's what we're told anyway. Now, of course, if you possess weapons for the purpose of safety, you're portrayed as being delusional. The government is there to protect you. They'll handle it. And there's some really good examples of this. Here's the government protecting the students at Kent State. Oh man, they looked so safe and protected on the ground. Well, and then here was the government protecting the women and children at Waco. So they must have been really cold. And they were actually so proud of their work that they decided to pose with it. It's pretty cool. Now listen, whatever you might think about the Branch Davidians, and believe me, I have some thoughts. Look at their flag. The ATF obtained the warrant based on a suspicion that they might be making automatic weapons. There was no concern for the people there. It was all about the property that they had that they weren't supposed to have. And of course, who could forget when the government had to protect the Weaver family? Now, they definitely had to be protected because they had moved to this remote area. So how else are you supposed to protect someone other than entrapping him because he sold a shotgun with a barrel that was an inch too short, then trying to coerce him into being a federal snitch, then giving him the wrong court date and setting up a raid where you kill his dog, his son, and his wife. I'm sure he felt very safe, very protected after that happened. Now, up to this point, I've only discussed legal measures, but we know that the law doesn't just materialize from the ether. This decay, it doesn't start or end in the government body. It extends to the people. There's an entire culture which has been subverted into begging, demanding to be made more helpless. And it's not enough that they're helpless. You have to be as well. Now, the irony is that the people who are screaming for gun control, they're not anti-gun. They just want those guns concentrated to the hands of government agents. So it's a unique danger because your enemy isn't just the government, it's the people who are supposedly your fellow citizens. Now, culture is a stronger source of change than politics on its own. In fact, it should be evident that culture and statecraft are necessarily intertwined. Laws on their own are easily disobeyed and circumvented, but we are social creatures, and when the broad masses express a disdain for something, and our media reinforces this notion, it does a great job at making an ordinary person into an outsider. Gun owners are portrayed as mad, frothing at the mouth, unhinged and bloodthirsty. And this propaganda isn't intended to sway someone like you or me. It's for people on the sidelines. It's intended to radicalize people who are already against the ownership of weaponry. So it has this reinforcing effect on politics, and it forms a feedback loop with culture. What you get is some limp dick like Beto O'Rourke can skateboard out on stage and talk about mandatory gun buybacks, which is just a really cowardly way of describing disarmament. And then when he does that, he sees a surge in popularity, even if it's temporary. But as this culture against being armed grows stronger, we can expect the political arm of that movement to strengthen in turn. And beyond just that this propaganda, it's intended to poison the developing minds of children. So what you wind up with are these various efforts to disarm people, but they use children as their shield or their mouthpiece. And anybody who then argues against the lines that these children are being used to propagate is made out as a bully for attacking the child. But, I mean, fuck, dude. If you want me to feel so bad about these schools getting shot up, then you definitely shouldn't be using them to indoctrinate children to believe shit that makes me glad they're getting It's easy to see who the outright enemies of the right to self-defense and arms are. But how is it that we've lost so much ground against a movement which should be easily routed? It should be easy for us to tell these people to go fuck themselves and form a hardened front, shouldn't it? Well, enter the responsible conservative. An enemy is reliable. You can always expect them to be in opposition to you. A traitor, it's a little more dangerous because they appear like an ally, but they undercut your position. And that's what we're describing when we speak of conservatives. Traitors. It's this, or they're cowards. They're too scared to break their rearguard defensive posture to ever actually fight back against the people who are assaulting them. And while assembled in this rearguard defense of ground that was lost 200 years ago, they haven't conserved anything. And they'll continue to give up ground in the name of conserving wherever it is they're standing at the moment. But you can't conserve something that's already been taken from you. And for an example of this, you don't need to look any further than a group like the NRA. So the NRA bill themselves as the oldest civil rights group in the country, and that is a load of shit. They were formed in 1871 by a couple of Union vets who witnessed how poorly the North performed against the South in terms of marksmanship. Basically, they were founded as a hobbyist club. And in 1920, they actually helped craft legislation that made it so permits would be required for concealed carry and allowed police to access records of gun sales. They supported the NFA and the FFA outright, completely. The NRA helped to set the foundation for infringement. And when the GCA passed, they did oppose a national registry and licensure for all gun carriers, but it wasn't until the 70s that the NRA actually adopted a stance of being against new gun control. And this didn't stop them from supporting the bump stock ban. So the issue is that they remain conservative in their stance. They're never going to take ground back. The best case scenario is that they'll just mitigate the loss of what we have now. I can't stress enough what a threat the conservative mentality is to the ownership of arms. There is all kinds of apologist bullshit for excusing gun control. Well, as a gun owner myself, I grew up around guns. I'm a veteran or a cop. I support the Second Amendment, but. There is no but. You either support the right to arms or don't. There's no qualifier. Now, worst of all is the justification of strategy. It's chess, not checkers. Motherfucker, if it's chess, who do you think the pawns are? You can't sacrifice part of something in the name of saving it. That is literally a loss. Honestly, even worse, and typically found among conservatives, people who carry water for police. The thin blue line cucks. So, the canard that police wouldn't enforce unconstitutional gun control is dismissed pretty easily by one observation. They already fucking do. And the incremental process that we're suffering, the law enforcers are just as subject to that as the citizenry, if not more so. Now, if you are among these lukewarm, limp-wristed, cowardly conservatives and you're prepared to cede more ground in the name of conserving where it is you stand, I don't expect any appeal to principle to change your mind. Consider this. You're next. The ground that you're standing on right now is only preserved by the position of those in front of you. And if you think you're safe with your bolt-action rifle, think again, because here's the line.
That's a high-powered rifle! It's a sniper's rifle! Who needs something like that?
Always pay attention to repeated terms and phrases. Now, the term high-powered rifle, that's the new assault weapon. And they've actually already managed to associate high-powered rifle with things like AR-15s. Now, some people might remember weapons of war, and that one didn't work out so well. But that 30-06 bolt gun, it's a much higher caliber than an AR-15 chambered in 5.56 NATO, and it's going to pierce level 3 plates. So that's all people are going to need to hear to support these high-powered rifles being the next thing which is taken in our systematic erosion of arms ownership. Now let's return for a moment to legal precedent. Most people are going to reference the 2008 Heller v. D.C. case as the one in which an individual right to firearms was determined by the Supreme Court. Now, the court ruled that the Second Amendment outlines the right of individuals to own firearms, unconnected with service in the militia. But this isn't actually the first time that this conclusion has been reached. Now, at the state level, we can look at an example from the Georgia Supreme Court, and this resulted from the first attempt at what we would term gun control today. In 1837, the state banned the sale and possession of pistols and some types of knives. Now, this resulted in the case of Nunn v. Georgia. And by 1846, this was overturned by the Georgia Supreme Court as unconstitutional. Despite having no language in their state constitution that outlined the right to bear arms, the court upheld that that wasn't relevant because the right already existed and was ensured at the national level. Now, the court went on to say the right of the whole people, old and young, men, women, and boys, and not militia only, to keep and bear arms of every description, not such merely as are used by the militia, shall not be infringed, curtailed, or broken in upon in the smallest degree. And all this for the important end to be attained, the rearing up and qualifying a well-regulated militia so vitally necessary to the security of a free state. So according to this, it's specifically the right of the people to keep and bear arms, and not just those in the militia. The ends are that a militia might be established, but that has nothing to do with the right to keep and bear arms itself. Not only that, but the style of weapons themselves aren't limited by only those that the militia would use. Now, it's worth noting, the Heller case actually referenced two previous cases, and these were United States v. Cruikshank and Presser v. Illinois. Now, in 1876, the Supreme Court determined in the Cruikshank ruling that the conflict between black and white militias hadn't constituted infringement of the First or Second Amendment on the blacks by the white militia. States and private actors aren't bound by these amendments according to the ruling. Now, it's worth noting that this case was actually overruled in 2010 by McDonald v. City of Chicago. In it, the Supreme Court ruled that the right to keep and bear arms for self-defense in one's home was protected under the Second Amendment, regardless of what states legislate, and that this was because the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. So later in 1886, the Supreme Court, in the case of Presser v. Illinois, concluded unanimously that the Second Amendment did not defend the right to assemble as a private military force and demonstrate publicly. Beyond that, they stated that the Second Amendment merely prevented Congress and any national or federal body of government from passing legislation limiting the ownership of weaponry. But the subtext of this is that if the Second Amendment is outlining anything, it's outlining the fact that people have a right to own weaponry in a private sense. So the Cruikshank and the Presser cases still both raise the question of how it is that we've gotten to the point that we're at as far as federal infringement goes. Because over the course of the next 100 years following these rulings, federal legislation incrementally encroached on the ability to own weaponry. It's because legalism is a pretense. This constant revisionism and reinterpretation of the Second Amendment, it is a pretense. And those committing revisionism know this, but they expect you to argue within the confines of it. Now, here's the truth. A document doesn't do shit for you. And the people who are moving the machine haven't given a fuck about the original intent for at least the past century. You know, we might need to entertain the notion that the American experiment had failed at its inception, that the component parts were already tainted. The ferment of decomposition had already set in. And I'm going to come clean now. And I know that you're not going to judge me. This is a safe space. I can admit this here. I don't give a fuck about the Constitution. What possible value could a document have for someone who understands that rights are derived through natural law? And that document has been totally disregarded. It's apparently open to being reinterpreted anytime people decide it doesn't suit their agenda. So ultimately, your rights are not secured by this document. And the Constitution itself doesn't grant anything. It just indicates what the limitation on the federal mandate of power is supposed to be. But force is the determining factor in seeing that limit guaranteed. You are the one who ultimately decides what rights you'll enjoy. Now, Lysander Spooner summed up the value of the Constitution when he said, "But whether the Constitution really be one thing or another, this much is certain, that it has either authorized such a government as we have had, or has been powerless to prevent it. In either case, it is unfit to exist." Now, let's take a moment to imagine that all of the gun control that exists today had been enacted at once, or even over the course of several years rather than nearly a century. What do you think the reaction would have been? I think that the people who were even suggesting this shit would have been dragged out of their homes and turned into lawn ornaments and tree decorations. But the links in our chains, they've been forged one at a time. And it always seems easier to allow one more link to be added rather than throwing the shackles off altogether. And we're in a position right now where the best thing that could happen as far as reversing all of this would be a policy of direct disarmament. And I know that that probably sounds crazy to some people, but ask yourself, what else is going to galvanize the armed populace to actively defending their rights? It's the gradual nature of infringement that has led us to where we are now. And that's going to be maintained until a combination of ever-restrictive laws and degenerative culture produce future generations that forego being armed altogether. And that's the real goal. It isn't to disarm each of us personally. It's just to make sure that none of us ever act, that you remain in stasis, and your children, or their children, however long it takes, think of your guns as a barbaric antiquity. So here are the logistics of directly disarming the American population. There are roughly 3 million people in the police and military combined, if you include reserves. Now, let's assume that not one of them defect. So it's estimated that there's around 70 million gun owners in the United States, and if we predict that even 1% of them are unwilling to comply with confiscation, what we're talking about are 700,000 people throughout the U.S. Now, how many among those numbers are going to act preemptively rather than waiting for a knock, or, well, actually, I guess the case might be a no knock at the door? How many are going to organize? What will the perception of a government be by the people on the sidelines? How gruesome would asymmetric insurgency look if it happened domestically? How many Marvin Heemeyers are out there? How many Ted Kaczynskis? How many Christopher Dorners? How many Timothy McVeighs? How many reasonable people are prepared to become unreasonable? You see, there's a finite amount of tolerance that people have in any given window of time. And right now, at least, confiscation is far beyond that tolerance. And for anybody out there who thinks that the government can't be resisted through force, remind yourself of this. Our military has spent the past 2 decades fucking around with inbred goat herders using Cold War era weaponry in a region where we don't give a shit about civilian casualties. Now, superimpose that chaos here and ask yourself how that could be maintained. Even if there were restraint, what's the amount of standoffs, raids, sieges that people are willing to hear about happening in the news, let alone see happening around them? And this is precisely why confiscation likely won't happen. Incrementalism is the form that our foes must take, but our form must be decisive if we're going to stop this, let alone reverse it. So where does that leave us then? What recourse do we have? If the Constitution and clear legal precedent aren't respected, by what means do we secure our right to bear arms? Violence. And you can use the term force if you like, but I want to make myself as clear as possible here. The use of force, of violence, is the only means by which any idea is enforced ultimately. Ideals on their own don't manifest anything. All ideas, all concepts, all systems require people to champion them. And that's why I chose to present this information rather than simply talking about moral absolutism, because the harsh reality is that whether morals be absolute or not, the determining factor in how we will see them realized is if we're willing to fight for them. Now, a brilliant mathematician actually had some words on the topic. Power depends ultimately on physical force. By teaching people that violence is wrong, except of course when the system itself uses violence via the police or military, the system maintains its monopoly on physical force and thus keeps all power in its own hands. And there's nothing wrong with violence in itself. In any particular case, whether violence is good or bad, depends on how it is used and the purpose for which it is used. Theodore John Kaczynski. You are living under a system that is held together entirely by the threat of violence, and most of us recognize this. But where we are met with violence, we must use violence in return. That is our natural right of self-defense. However, in our current formation, the use of force in a vacuum is no solution against anything. We have to be properly organized to be effective. Otherwise, it's a swarm of gnats trying to consume a mammoth. Now, I don't think anybody should rush tumultuously to arms. In fact, I think that this needs to be methodical and ideally avoid direct conflict. And that brings me to the most important form of armament that I believe we need right now. Rearming the spirit. What I've come to understand is that it is not physical or material means that are preventing us from protecting our rights to arms or even establishing a society based in natural law. The fact is that in general, we do have access to the tools necessary to enforce natural law. We might lack artillery, tanks, aircrafts, but what we really seem to lack is will, or perhaps spirit. When I speak of spirit, what do I mean? Well, isn't it fair to characterize the essence, the will of people or a movement as having spirit? What do we refer to when we describe something like ideological possession? Ideas and concepts are transcendent. They exist unto themselves, but they're then divined and championed by humans. And these ideas and concepts are not mere abstractions, but the expression of an essence or a spirit. Now, natural law may very well exist unto itself, and it precedes human organisms, but it still must be realized. And what that means is this essence or spirit of natural law has to be envisioned. It has to be discovered, then understood, and then after this process it can be employed. But for that, struggle and success are the deciding factors in seeing natural law brought about. Now, you can look through history and you'll find liberty has never fallen from the sky. Rights aren't bestowed by a master. They're taken, they are demanded, and they're fought for imperiously. It's rooted in our will. It's the work that we're prepared to do to make things so. And it's ongoing. Liberty isn't just won and then displayed as a trophy. Our current state is proof of that. A society has to always care for freedom in its maintenance. So the foundation for freedom will always be built on the bedrock of discipline and duty. So the longer a problem is allowed to exist, the more difficult it is to rectify. And the worse a problem is, generally, the worse the solution tends to be. We're not getting any closer to a free state. Things are only getting worse. And I don't think I'm bursting any bubbles when I say that. No one's shocked by me saying that. And I know the perception is out there. I'm not the only one who thinks this. We're heading towards, fuck that. We're sprinting towards collapse. And the notion of collapse isn't laughed off anymore. Several years ago, maybe people would have made you out as a madman for talking about something like that. But the edges of this reality are starting to come into focus for all of us now. And of course, you have at least a segment of the population who spent a few years talking about an impending civil war. Now, nobody wants to be honest about what that would actually look like. I mean, what do you fucking think that people are going to put on colored shirts and they're going to form fronts? It's not going to happen like that. But regardless of whatever fantasies people have, this idea, this notion of collapse has been admitted into the public consciousness. And what people believe tends to manifest to some extent, because if people believe that something is possible, then they're inclined to act it out. Now, consider the events of the last year. You had people who legitimately believed that a Chinese bat cold was going to kill all of us. Fuck, some people still believe that shit. I wish. Don't get my dick hard. Now, it doesn't matter that collapse didn't actually happen, that the spicy cold wasn't actually that spicy. People believed it. Now, as a result of that, the cracks in the system are beginning to show. And it's a matter of time before all of this falls apart. And I know that a lot of people are thinking, well, that's our chance. That's when we move. Wait for the system to fall and establish our own. And I don't think that's the wrong idea necessarily. But we have to remember, collapse is a process, not an event. Things can get much worse between now and the actual dissolution of this system. What do you think the logistics of setting up any kind of social order in the middle of an industrial collapse that's going to look like 90s Yugoslavia and the fall of Rome would be? Now, certainly you have to act between then and now in order to be prepared. So, as established earlier, we know that we must have the same tools as our foes in order to do battle with them. But this isn't just true in the mere physical sense. It's true at every level. If your enemy uses a weapon against you, you have to pick up the same weapon. And to fail in doing so, believing that you maintain some form of honor, it's a mistake. There's no honor in losing. There's no honor in letting our fire die out, and posterity is going to curse us all for not striking back at our enemies with the tools that they used against us. And when I speak of tools, I'm not only referring to physically held armaments. We have to consider that organizational structure and overall form are tools in themselves. And this is where I've come to identify a few structural issues in the modern struggle for liberty. The hyper-individualist mindset imbalance. And listen, to suggest that there's an individualist imbalance doesn't imply that we ought to adopt a collectivist imbalance, which is where our opposition is in general. But the collective and the individual ought to strengthen one another in a proper structure. It's evident that most, if not all, revolutionary ideas, they begin in the mind of an individual. But that idea, whether it's technical or philosophic, it requires a collective force to see it realized. Now, the individual itself, it's produced through sexual union. So you're born into a collective form of family to begin with. Well, actually, communists just congeal in gutters. That is a little known fact. They're fucking effective though, right? Like, that's how impressive the magnifying force of a collective arrangement can be. Now, in the collectivist imbalance, the horde cannibalizes the individual to sustain the group. And of course, because it's comprised of individuals, that means that the structural integrity is threatened over time. And because they're in this collectivist imbalance, the individual that's produced is pretty weak on their own. Like, have you ever seen one? The individualist imbalance does have the benefit of producing a stronger singular unit, but without the ability to network beyond the self, they lack the ability to project any unified front. There may as well not be a culture. So the other issue that is derivative of that is that we're atomized. We have the understanding of an individual that would act in self-defense, but what do we do when the assault that we're facing is by a collective force and it's experienced in aggregate? We're already divided and we're being conquered. Now, consider the militia as a collective form. You have to muster, you have to organize. And because all great movements are driven through this collective assembly, and for as long as we remain clinging to this individualistic, atomized notion, we can't get anything done. There is no movement. Now, shedding this notion alone isn't enough. And I'm not suggesting that we overtly form militias. I'm not suggesting communes, compounds, any bullshit like that. I'm not going to Fed post at you. The obvious solution, though, is regional organization. We have to take up the attitude of a territorial imperative and turn away from areas that are too divergent from our values. As much as possible, we should be moving into areas that already have some overlap of values with ours, and ideally networking with each other in real life, because how else are we going to get this done? Now, if we accept that we're under assault and that we're being deprived of our fundamental rights, and we can see that things are only getting worse, we need to regroup. We're being routed. We're losing. And we already recognize that we're an extreme minority. And in our current formation, we can't project this unified culture that we need to affect change in any way. Only through regional organization can we begin this process of cultural change in areas that are already amenable to our values. Now, the other issue that I see is political pacifism. And what do I mean by this? I mean that abstinence from voting on the principle that it's violence isn't a solution. And who the fuck said anything about us not using violence to get what we want? The system is already in place and it's already being used against you, whether you engage with it or not. Believe me, I'm not telling you to get invested in politics. Politics is a fucking illusion. It's kabuki theater for the mentally and the morally retarded. But I understand politics as a weapon. And if my enemies pick it up, then I'm going to pick it up. And so what if it's not ideal? That's how it is. We're standing at the bottom of this pyramid of federalism, and the average person is looking at the apex, hoping that they can change it from the top. Now, if we're serious about tearing the structure down, we need to begin at the bottom. Properly organized, we might find that we can utilize local elections as a way of gaining deeper regional footholds, magnify the cultural and political effect that we have. And whether we can influence local politics or not, the worst case scenario is that we're better organized physically. Abstinence from voting is not a solution. It is another form of passive behavior that passes itself off as principle. We are in a triage situation, and what I see is that there are specific groups of people, and this is true throughout history as well, that understand natural law. We can insist that it exists unto itself all we want, but it requires these people to live it out. And those are the people that I'm speaking to. Those are the people that I'm concerned with arming. Those are the people that I'm concerned with seeing come out on the other side of this. I don't have the latitude at this point to worry about people who deny that there is any such thing as natural law or absolute morality. I couldn't care less about what happens to them, really. Now, maybe you're worried about getting put on some kind of list. Now, if you're at the point where you're worried about being put on a list, then you're at the point where you need to start being serious about action. And if you're watching this shit, I bet you're already on a list somewhere. So, all of that being said, natural law is not a political movement. It isn't political. A political movement is content to occupy space alongside other parties. This is a philosophy. It's a way of being. I have no concern for politics itself, but to fashion a weapon from natural law and shape it as a political cudgel may be a necessity. And in the same way that parity of arms and force are preferable or perhaps even necessary in dealing with an opponent, we should consider organizational structure an extension of that. So what would it look like? What would the form of a movement advocating natural law be? Well, to start, because we accept that at the outset, natural law is an objective system of morality, it means that there can be no compromise in our values. There is not an option to negotiate or legislate them. So it's anti-democratic by its very nature, and to the extent that we use democratic systems, this is only to mitigate our current state with the hope and the intent of supplanting them. And because this is absolute, we would categorically, we have to reject any system that advocates relativism of morality or truth. How the fuck are you even supposed to build a society with relativists? Could you imagine trying to build a house with someone who doesn't think that there's an objective way to measure space? Because that's actually how absurd it is. And if relativists were honest, they might just take a neutral stance on anybody who disagrees with them. But how do you even justify the conclusions that you've come to as a relativist? Well, the truth is that relativists are actually just egoists who are very dishonest. But that is a very cool workaround for the problem of publicity. Now, in addition, a movement that's advocating natural law would recognize that hierarchy is both naturally emergent and necessary to a functioning society. So it is therefore in opposition to the notion of egalitarianism. Now, if the idea of egalitarianism were true, then there would be no way to account for any differences between people arising to begin with. It should be plain on its face that hierarchy cannot be dissolved, that it manifests in so many innumerable ways you couldn't begin to list them. It is simply a system of organization on whatever basis that you choose: physical, mental, spiritual. Now, hierarchy has to naturally emerge in any society because it's the only way to allow for proper division of labor and societal structure. Now, further, private property would be a necessary function of this society. And it follows that if we understand that an individual possesses their own body, then any labor that is performed by this individual by proxy must be theirs fully. And so to this end, all forms of slavery must be prohibited. The implications of this would have to extend to the total abolition of taxation on labor or private property. So I don't know. Let's visualize it. Okay, here's you. Yeah, you. Here's me. and here's a bunch of other people. And then we're all advocating natural law. So there's natural law. And then I don't know, it's our principle and we're bound to it. So what would that look like? Oh, fuck. Okay. Take that down. Don't take that down. Don't show that. No one wants to see that. So here's the thing about symbols. Symbols are interesting because they always express an idea. They always have a history associated with them. And there is this inarguable intent behind symbol. Are you advancing the slides? Okay, stop. Cut. Okay, like, you don't believe in voodoo, but if you found out that I had a voodoo doll of you, you'd probably have some fucking questions. You'd want to know what my intent was. Okay, you definitely don't want to go back and look at any of that. I wouldn't want you to get the wrong idea in your head. And you better get used to keeping bad ideas out of your head, because in a few years, when the government starts installing screens in our foreheads, people are actually going to be able to see you thinking the wrong thoughts. So, the ideal of a society based in natural law is one that we could understand to be an enlightened society. There's one major issue, though. Enlightenment movements don't work. And if they did, Buddha or Christ would have seen this done a long time ago. One of them literally pieced out and left us with a cool spin-off of Jainism, and the other got violently murdered and then had his teachings distorted into Judaism, the extended universe. Now, basically, if Enlightenment movements worked, I wouldn't be doing this spoken word shit post, but here I am, and there you are, and before long, maybe we'll be hanging out in a FEMA camp together. So I think that we can agree that Enlightenment movements have not been effective. Now, I've come to believe that liberty and natural order, they're not really solutions to anything in themselves. They're ends. So we need some sort of means in order to achieve them. And if we're talking about an enlightenment system or an enlightenment society, well, maybe there is something that we can glean some knowledge from. How about alchemy? Now, I know a lot of people, they just think of alchemy as being the medieval predecessor to chemistry. And that's not entirely wrong, but it's not correct either. Alchemy is much better thought of as a spiritual form of chemistry, rather than a rudimentary one. The literal notion of turning lead into gold was propagated throughout the Middle Ages. But rather than keeping piss in jars and discovering phosphorus, yeah, seriously, look it up. For like 100 years, that's the only way that they got phosphorus. What alchemy truly concerns itself with is the transformation of the base into the noble. Lead and gold. The base and the noble. Saturn and the sun. It's an occult system. And it has to be understood that when I say occult, I refer to a mystery tradition. To occult something literally means to hide it. It comes from the Latin oculare, which means to conceal. Disabuse yourself of notions of devil worship. If anything, the Satanism that informs our current state is taunting us openly. Now, alchemy was occulted by means of association with chemical elements. Obviously, it was effective because the alchemists of the Middle Ages endeavored this practice literally, and many were hunted to death as a result of this. So, alchemy proposes the creation of the magnum opus, the great work. And the exoteric understanding of this is that it allows the user to change lead into gold. Now, the esoteric understanding is that the creator of the magnum opus achieves enlightenment and eternal life. Now, I'm not going to get into talking about the metaphysics of the eternal spirit in Egypt. If you want to learn about that, read Hall, Churchward, Evola. That is a little beyond our scope here. Now, taking the exoteric and the esoteric understanding of alchemy, it would be correct to say that the highest goal is to attain enlightenment, the byproduct of which would be the destruction of the monetary system of its time. And I don't find that this is coincidental. In fact, it seems quite deliberate. More than the simple threat of violence has produced our slave state. And if our desire is to be free, then we have to understand how it is that we've come to be enslaved without any steel on our wrists. In some ways, in many ways, that would actually be much better than where we are now. Because the spiritual chains that we're bound in aren't apparent to many people. At least actual chains would make it abundantly clear what it is you were. Now, I'm not going to pretend to be some type of Puritan here, but we all know that a great degree of our position is owed to material comfort that we enjoy. And to some extent, we're all complicit in this. And that's a difficult thing to contend with, because we're forced to recognize that we've been complicit in allowing ourselves to reach this point. The effect of this decadence in aggregate is that we get a culture that venerates degeneracy. And when I say degeneracy, I refer to the pursuit of physical or material pleasure as an ends in itself. The effect that this has on someone is that the bar for stimulation runs ever higher, and they become a greater slave to vice. Now, this material trap prevents any scaling of natural law, because morality is not a material construct. And through morality, we can come to understand that vice is a self-harm disguised as pleasure. Ultimately, this might just amount to keys being jingled before us. These plastic purveyors of human decadence are distracting us from something worse. I think most of us are familiar with the danger that the founders attributed to a standing army, but there are other institutions which were warned against as well. Thomas Jefferson had this to say: "I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around the banks will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent that their fathers conquered." And he doesn't mince words. Conquered. More than once, I've heard it said that the religion of money must be contended with if we're to establish a society based in natural law. And I had to spend a lot of time thinking about this because I didn't understand what it meant. For as long as I can think of, understood that money was just a tool of intermediary exchange. It's a token of value. And I had no consideration for it beyond that. So first I had to break it down. Well, what is money? Well, Aristotle outlined the qualities of sound money as being durable, portable, divisible, and having intrinsic value by being scarce, fungible, and cognizable. And he recognized that wealth or money were not ends in themselves, but means to an end. The viability of a barter economy becomes an impossibility as civilizations scale. So we use money as a tool to facilitate exchange. And really, it's just a token of value. But perhaps this tool has been perverted. Maybe it's been shaped in such a way that it has helped fashion the shackles we're bound in. Benjamin Franklin actually offers some advice on the matter. When you run in debt, you give another power over your liberty. Okay? Debt. We are in debt. And whether you have debt personally or not, that doesn't matter to our government. Mechanically, there's nothing wrong with debt itself. It's just a negative countenance of value. But here's the situation that we're in. We're at the bottom of a hole, and we've got a shovel, and we're supposed to dig our way out. So what do I mean? I mean that you're never getting out. I mean that no matter how laborious you or I or anybody else are, we're only going deeper. Debt constitutes the material of these chains in some way, but a very specific mechanism has been used to shape these links in the chain and mutate this otherworldly state of permanent growth divorced from actual creation that money has attained. This allows the generation of money from money itself. So it dissociates it from a correlation with productive value. Interest. It's the lifeblood that sustains this religion of money as it stands today. Interest guarantees that we will never pay off the monolithic debt liability that has been accrued. And at the same time, it ensures that past a certain threshold, wealth will continue to compound on itself. But what is money supposed to be? Well, if we accept that it's just a stand-in for value, we have to ask ourselves, what new value has been produced by allowing money to stagnate? What additional value has been lost in the case of debt interest? If money is meant to be accountants of value, then something of value has to be produced or lost to justify this perpetual growth, unless we want to sanitize money of any connection to productivity and labor. And realize that for anybody outside of the highest echelons of wealth, interest is a swindle and a pretense. It's a poor excuse to make you feel like you're part of the club. The pittance of interest that's offered to the ordinary person makes no real difference. And it's likely that you've watched positive interest rates fall over the course of the last few years extensively. The rate of interest that you have, that I have, it doesn't offset the inflation that we experience, and it doesn't even come close to the interest on debt. And if you want to know where consumer interest is heading, look to zero, and then keep going. Most of all, I have to question the logic behind it. Consider that if you perform an action that earns you a certain amount of money, the amount of work for which you were paid doesn't change, no matter how much time passes. So then, under any natural fashion, why would that sum increase through inaction? The traditional justification for interest is that it's based on the value it could have generated if not loaned out, or that it's a fee associated with the risk of lending, that it's the cost of liquidity. Well, if something of value could have been done if it hadn't been loaned out, then why loan it out? We don't hold that investment should carry any form of guaranteed return, and it should be noted that the investment model is mutually beneficial. The same system which has monopolized justice, security, property ownership, it backs the institution of loan capital. You know, the same system that bailed banks out when they issued too much loan capital. So, what loan capital offers is the illusion of being responsible for productive activity, but it relies entirely on the productive capacity of the borrower. In the event that the borrower isn't able to pay back the principal and the accrued interest, they remain in a personal state of debt servitude. The justification of interest as a cost of risk is a pragmatic excuse, but it doesn't address the issue of decoupling money from value production through labor itself. And it doesn't address the fact that the state of debt servitude is actually preferable to the lender because they stand to gain exponentially more money as interest continues to pile on. So that might be justified by arguing that the borrower consented to the terms. But you're not going to consent when your debt gets sold to another agency that modifies the interest rate. And you're not going to consent to your currency being debased through inflation while your earning power goes down and then the cost of goods goes up, all while the interest on your debt accrues at the same rate. But the issue of debt slavery extends past personal debts into our national debt, which affects us in aggregate. It leverages all public formations, and that necessarily affects all the private formations that exist within that system. And there's no way to argue consent to the debt that our government leverages. And while we continue to fail in servicing even the interest on our debt, The costs for this must eventually result in the raising of taxes on land and property, commercial taxes, income tax, and the effects of that increase the cost of agricultural products, rent, all productive industry. And then, even still, the burden on individual families grows greater. So, industrial, productive investment capital, it's limited in the finite, but interest will continue to grow without any relation to production itself. You work harder, and the chains get heavier. Jefferson had this to say as well. To preserve our independence, we must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt. Now, if interest is serving to propagate that debt, well, liberation from enslavement to interest on money is the clear motto for the global revolution, for the liberation of productive labor from the chains of supragovernmental money powers. Gottfried Feder. If the worship of money must end in order to create an enlightened society, one based in natural law, then the mechanism of interest must be one of the heads that we sever from the beast. And we can bookend that with something else that Aristotle had to say in the Nicomachean Ethics. Money was established for exchange, but interest causes it to be reproduced by itself. Therefore, this way of earning money is greatly in conflict with the natural law. What I've come to understand about the nature of money worship is that because money is an abstract form of valuation, but given material form, it allows for the trivialization of the value that it's meant to represent. Again, a means and an ends become confused, and money avails itself as a vector for material worship. Money worship is ultimately just material worship. So it must be made clear that money is nothing more than a token meant to represent value, which has a direct and necessary connection to physical and intellectual labor. I'm not talking about the abolition of money, but the destruction of the false religion that is formed around it. And when I refer to money as a false religion, it might be more accurate to say that it's a cult. How and where do we make the distinction between a cult and a religion? Well, a religion binds itself to a fixed ideal. It's something which is transcendent, and this must apply to their principles as well as any figures of worship. A cult follows a human figure or an object, something that's physical, subject to change. There's no true surety. And without a fixed form of idealism, its foundations are built on shifting sand. Insofar as a person is followed, it can only ever be incidental, merely because they're guided by the same light as the other. To reiterate, I don't find that liberty itself is a means to anything. At the very least, I think we've mistaken liberty for permissiveness for so long that we've allowed ourselves to enter this modern state of serfdom. Liberty is the end state. It's the product of a people enlightened and noble enough to assemble their society in such a way as to deserve that state. And I think it may be worth noting that if liberty or freedom had the appeal that so many claim it does, we wouldn't be in the position that we are right now. So this assembly, this is our great work, and it's the work that will set us free. And when I say that our spirits must be rearmed, I believe that the process for this is to come to an understanding of what the material realm is. Now, why the fuck would I ramble about money and interest and materialism in talking about rearming the spirit? Well, what I see is that our spirit has weakened as a result of the import that we place on material. And I'm not advocating asceticism. I'm not telling you to withdraw from society and become a monk. I simply think that we need to have a proper understanding of what material or physicality are. I would reference the tradition of Zoroastrianism, Hermeticism, or Gnosticism as movements which had a proper understanding of material. And we could even refer to Immanuel Kant, who spoke to the notion or the distinction between phenomenon and noumenon, the outward realm of sensory experience and the underlying reality of things in themselves. Essentially, that the material realm is one that is composed of symbols which represent and are associated with an underlying reality. Now, at the very least, I would propose that this is a more useful way to understand reality. And consider that natural law, it's not material in how it exists, but its manifestation in material interaction between humans can be observed and quantified. So something which is not material itself becomes observable through the principle of correspondence. And this is where the proper assembly of physical elements becomes vital. Ritual. So many of us have this notion that society is essentially a large-scale ritual. Well, a ritual or a rite is a symbolic act. It's a physical ceremony that invokes result. And we could ask, what result? What end is it that the current ritual we are involved in is invoking? I mean, if history is any indication, then I suppose that it's a mass sacrifice. It's collapse, like Sumer, like Babylon, like Egypt, like Rome, and so many others. So in the formation of a society based in natural law, what I see is that we're ultimately engaging a ritual which assembles things to a certain order. And in the process of assembly and symbolic arrangement, the ends that we invoke are to manifest natural law. I'll reiterate, I don't find that liberty itself is a means to anything. At the very least, I think that we've mistaken liberty for permissiveness for so long that we've allowed ourselves to enter this modern state of serfdom. Liberty is the end state. It is the product of a people enlightened and noble enough to assemble their society in such a way as to deserve that state. And I think it may be worth noting that if liberty or freedom had the appeal that so many claim it does, we wouldn't be living the way we are right now. It's unquestionable that we have a natural right to self-defense. And it's this will to fight back that ensures any organism's place on this earth. This is true at the individual level and at the collective level. And we might ask ourselves again, though, what would that look like? What would it look like for thousands or millions of people to champion an absolutist philosophy, to threaten the monetary system, which is international in its structure? Has this ever been attempted before? And what is it that's being described? What would people call us? What would the symbol of this rigid Enlightenment movement be? I can see it now, breaking on the horizon, just as things are at their darkest. It's a force of nature, and it can't be stopped. The sun. Thank you for your time.